So let's really dive in today. Our installment today is called The First 90 Days of the Head of DesignOps. I've already introduced myself. Hello, there I am. And I'm going to pass it over to introduce our amazing speakers today, Salome and Adam. Salome and Adam, would you like to intro yourselves?
Yeah, sure. Salome, I'll go ahead and start, I guess. Hey, everyone, I'm Adam. Thanks so much, Kate, and thank you so much to Figma for sharing your platform with us. This is really cool. Currently, I'm over at Google. I'm pretty new, so I probably won't be talking about my perspective over there. I just came from DocuSign, where I was in a design ops leadership role there, and I've been doing design operations for a little over a decade, although we used to not call it that. And I'm just really excited to share some of the things that we've learned along the way. Also, I'm a partner over in the DesignOps Assembly. We'll mention a lot of DesignOps community today, and I just encourage everyone that if you're listening and you're curious and you want to connect with other DesignOps professionals, come hang out with Salome, Kate, and I over in the DesignOps Assembly. So that's me.
Awesome. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Kate. And thank you, everyone that's joined from all around the world. That's so exciting to see all the DesignOps practitioners here. My name is Salome. I live in Seattle. I'm Canadian. I lead the DesignOps teams at SiriusXM, Pandora, Stitcher, Simplecast, so anything with digital streaming is the area that I lead. It's a really cool team. Plug, we are hiring, so I just wanted to throw it out there. I started my career in design. So for years, I was a designer and a design consultant. So like Adam, I realized all of a sudden I was doing design ops and I kind of found my way in this area. And I'm excited to talk to you all today.
Amazing. Thanks y'all for the intros. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we're going to kick off the conversation. So I will pass it over to Adam to get us going.
Yeah, cool. Like I said, Salome and, well, I guess I haven't mentioned this yet, but Salome and I are both teachers in this thing called Learning Labs over in the DesignOps Assembly. What this is these are like 12-week classes where small groups of DesignOps practitioners get together and we just learn together. I've had the pleasure of getting to hang out with Salome in a previous iteration of this where it was just a bunch of other heads of design operations and we were just kind of sharing our perspective and asking each other challenging questions along the way. So what we thought that we'd do is I would actually kind of just flip the microphone over to Salome and ask her a few questions, both from her active perspective at Sirius, as well as kind of a chance for us to just like share all the other really cool stuff that we've learned from some of our peers in these design operation leadership roles. What we decided to do is kind of put this in a hypothetical of like, what does the first 90 days look like? I just went through this at DocuSign not too long ago. Salome went through this, and like I said, so did some of our peers. So we'll frame the entire thing up by telling everyone who's on the call. Imagine that you're a head of design operations and you're in your first 90 days. It's kind of the punchline of what to expect here. So Salome, at the last call that we had with Figma, the entire thing was really revolving around what is design operations and how can people kind of figure out how to be successful in that role. This idea of a listening tour came up as kind of a through line best practice within the first 90 days of any function. But can you just kind of recap what that listening tour means to you? And then we can kind of use that to segue into what the first 90 days should look like for a head of design ops.
Yeah, totally. Thanks, Adam. So the listening tour is just another name for, I think of it as onboarding or discovery tour, whatever you want to call it. But there's that period within the first couple of weeks, maybe a month, if you're given the space and runway to do so. You're onboarding and you're connecting and talking to different teams. And so making that time really intentional and making sure that the list of folks that you're talking to, you're really capturing insights and packaging them in a way that's going to be really helpful for you, your plan, and also your leadership is how I would typically discuss approaching the listening tour. So, when I join any company, and I wanted to underline too, it's not just for like the heads of design ops. I think it's, for all folks here who are aspiring heads of design ops or just design ops practitioners. I think the listening tour is so important. And I think of it as a continuous listening tour because, as design ops practitioners, we're constantly, hopefully listening to our team and connecting with them. But how I typically spend my first 2 to 4 weeks is listening to each of the different partners, whether it's in design ICs, design managers, directors, engineers, PMs, and then I have a set of questions that I prepare for them. And very similar to how you'd approach a study and, doing user research, that's kind of how I approach it. And I have these series of topics that I want to cover. And then I also leave some room for connecting with that individual, and then also capturing insights that might, not even be on my question list. So then by the end of the listening tour, I, synthesize it and package it up and provide it for my leadership, and then use it as kind of like my roadmap. We can talk about that a little bit later if that's interesting too.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so your listening tour sounds like it sounds like this is very much a designed moment. That it's kind of organic, kind of scientific. It also sounds like you're capturing this in a place. Can you just talk a little bit more, like take us there? Like what's the actual mechanisms look like, let's say in the first 30 days? Where does the listening tour start? Where are you at maybe your 30th day into this? And then also you mentioned leadership and how you're kind of calibrating this with them. Can you talk a little bit more about how you're staying aligned, but you're also still going wide and doing your listening tour?
Totally. A lot of questions in one question, but I'll start with how I approach the listening tour. So the mechanics of it, I typically, because my design background, I like to be tactile and move stickies around, but in our virtual world, that's kind of hard. So I've been using, before I was using Miro, now I use FigJam, actually in my last listening tour. And I have a series of questions. I have a series of user interviews, which are, candidates or users from our organization, which is PMs, designers, engineers. And I have my series of questions, and they're drafted in a way that are going to get to the goals that I'm trying to achieve, which is always tied to design maturity. There's different models of design maturity. And so what I typically do is I talk about the wins, the challenges, the obstacles, magic wands, and then I ask very specific questions depending on where they fall on the design maturity. And for folks that don't know, the design maturity is, I use this design maturity assessment, which is it's like a 9 dimensions of maturity defined by Leah Bewley and the New Design Frontier. And it's basically assessing an organizational maturity and the correlation of the business impact of design with how much design is actually part of an organization. And so I think, if my memory serves me right, it's 2,200 different companies were part of this study. And so it's the largest study to date. And so why I use it is because it helps me to find focus. And so across the 9 dimensions that apply to every design company, regardless of the industry they come from, it helps me to really be laser focused to finding operational and also just, across the different dimensions, opportunities, not only for myself, but also for my leadership. So I'll craft the questions. And let's say if I'm talking to a product manager, I'll ask the series of questions that go across all of the different interviews that I'll be doing. But for the product manager one in specific, one of the dimensions is key partnerships. So I'll focus on some of those criteria in terms of collaboration, how we work with products, metrics, outcomes. And so I try to understand what are some of the opportunities and challenges from their perspective. Same thing with engineering. If I'm talking to design executives, I'll, focus on leadership and executives and figure out where we are. I see designers in the design team dimension. And so what it does, it helps as a helpful framework for me to be able to synthesize my findings. And so, as you can imagine, for folks that haven't seen it, it's a wheel with the 5 different dimensions, and then all 5 different levels, and then the 9 dimensions. And so I can basically synthesize my notes real time in different colors according to the person I was talking to, and then synthesizing those themes by the end of my 30 days and having it play back with my leadership. And so it's kind of like a cool, I don't know if that's how you're supposed to use it. It's just the way I use it. I like to use it like that. I find it helpful because I've yet to meet a design leader that didn't want to advance their design maturity, regardless of where we are. Every designer is like, how can we advance our design maturity? And so this is a really nice framework to use. And so it makes the onboarding dual purpose. So you are onboarding, but you're also providing value really quickly by showing the opportunities within the organization in a very clear to understand way for your executives.
Yeah, that's we've talked about this in the past, both you and I, as well as the previous group that I mentioned, that Head of DesignOps cohort from about a year ago. And that was something that, there was a few ideas that were said over the time where we were all together. And I remember that one kind of catching fire. I tried it back at DocuSign. It was such a big hit because, to your point, I think a lot of us, maybe we don't say we want to mature our organization, but we typically want to leave places in a better place than when we found them, more valuable, more organized, just better to work at, better for the users. And saying, a more mature design organization is just another way to say all the stuff that I just listed off, right? And so the design maturity assessment that you're talking about from Envision, the other one from McKinsey and Adobe, all this stuff is really just a way to benchmark a current organization's ability to provide value to the business. So whatever index that you end up using, your point is that during the listening tour, use one of them and hook your findings into it, and then you can map it out. And so you're doing two things. One is trying to figure out what the kind of the opportunity is for design operations within this broader context. And two, almost doing like a really lean version of a maturity study. Not perfect, but directionally valuable for sure. And that's just something that ever since I heard that idea from you, I've used that. And I've told friends and other people as well. And I can just say, small data points here, but it's totally worked. I'm doing that actually right now as well.
What day are you at? And now I think
I'm just before the 45th day.
Okay.
So yeah. But yeah, the whole point is it's a total judo move, and it's worked really, really well for me. And thank you for teaching that. I'm curious though, I've only had a few cycles with this. Maybe I've gotten lucky. I haven't really ever hit any resistance along the way, other than almost it seemed like once I had presented my findings within the context of a maturity index, there was actually a pull to want to do like a more hardcore study about all things design maturity. That's the only point of resistance that I've ever encountered. Have you ever found that during your listening tour or this specific piece with the design maturity index, are there any like trap doors, booby traps, pitfalls that maybe somebody should watch out for as they go through this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know if there are any resistance, but I think everyone is afforded couple of weeks, hopefully more, to onboard. And so what I typically do, I don't go in with my plan. I don't say like, hey, I'm going to be running an audit and, I'm going to tell you how mature your organization is. Cause like that seems really heavy. It seems really unclear. And I think it's more impactful and powerful to just show and organize your findings in that way. And so I think everyone is afforded, hopefully, those onboarding times. And so it's just a matter of using that onboarding time to be able to then synthesize your findings and actually make it valuable, not only to you, but to your organization. But being a fan of being lean and doing just enough work, just enough research, I don't talk to everyone, because you start to see themes starting to appear. So I like to wrap up the study around the 30-day mark. That doesn't mean that I'm going to stop talking to people. I'm going to still continue to talk to people, build relationships, get to know people, but at least I have something actionable for me, and also for my leadership. And I also have some low-hanging fruit that I can start to act on. I guess the only pitfall or gotcha I would watch out for is you're going to provide all these opportunities to your leadership, and everything is going to sound really good, and they're going to want to do everything all at once. And I don't know about you, but I've been in the past a team of one, and I'm sure a lot of people, I think the latest was 50% of our design ops leaders are a team of one, which is really surprising to me, which means we have a lot of work. And so we want to be really intentional about the prioritization. So we want to present those findings and make sure that the leadership team knows your capacity. So typically what I do is, as these themes that get prioritized, I find out the business impact and match it to something, whether we have a benchmark or if we need to identify the benchmark. I try to tie it to the OKRs that the design leadership team has set or the broader organization has set. If we don't have that, that's okay. There's some qualitative and quantitative measures, a lot of like surveys and pulse surveys and Jira dashboards, kind of like results will help get at some of those low-hanging fruit metrics. So you can define those. And then from there, I think it's really important to create an organized roadmap. So I've learned this from our product folks, focus is really important. And I think focus is even more important for us. It's one of the most surprising things is like how little time we invest in ourselves. And I say like self-care for product ops, design ops, because we're always like helping everyone, fixing challenges and problems, but we don't really take the time to be strategic. Yeah. And when you're a small team, it's even more important to do that. So I think it's really important to do that, be very clear. And there's, also align with your charter and there's other tools like the menu you can use, but being really clear about the prioritization is super important.
Yeah, maybe let's start to shift to there. And I see there's some questions coming up around sources. I'll just come in and provide a little clarity. And then Salome, I'd like to move on to where we're actually centralizing all this stuff. You mentioned the charter. I think that's where we'll go, but we're probably going to be referencing some facts and figures. There's a report out there called the State of Design Ops Report. It's in its second official year at the size that it's at now. I see that Kristen, thank you so much for dropping that in there, that you had dropped in the chat, although it looks like it's just a host and panelist. So let's repaste this. Oh, thank you. Thanks, Vanessa. The cool thing is, if you're on this call, I'm going to give you a little bit of early access. So we're actually making the next report right now. There's kind of some cool news, which is last year, there was a heck of a lot more teams of one than there are this year. There's quite a huge category growth from teams of sizes of 2 to 4 and 5 to 9. But there's still a lot of teams of one. I think it's around like 25% now, which is wild to think of just like how much that this one person is doing. Let's go ahead and talk about like where we actually start to tag these learnings and then figure out what to do with it. You mentioned a lot of things, road mapping, laddering, like kind of following up your goal setting framework, whether it's OKRs or whatever, all the way up your reporting and comms lines, hopefully to the office of the CEO, but at least to the product area that you're supporting. I've heard of a lot of different terms for what this thing is that we're going to talk about. I like to use the word charter. Others have used the word strategic plan. There's all sorts of stuff, but we use the framing charters for this stuff. Can you talk about, at this point, we've kind of talked about getting up to day 30, where you're really kind of drawing a line in the sand of when maybe the study should be finishing, to where you've kind of identified some themes. For me, it's a little later, so don't stress out if you're not at the 30-day. But then after you align with leadership and you share out kind of what's going on, what you've learned, take me to your action plan. What does your charter look like? How are you prioritizing? Are you doing this by yourself, with partners? Take us to like day 30 to 60 and how you're actually putting together your action plan.
Totally. And so similarly, I like the term charter, and I see a lot of our teams use charters. And so I think of the charter as more consistent and constant. And so as an artifact to tell the organization who you are, what you do, what you don't do. And then the roadmap is kind of like your strategy for the year, and it often updates quarterly, probably more often. And so I think the charter is a really good calibration tool with your leadership team, and also, for you to differentiate yourself against like all the other operations teams. I don't know if, in the audience, if you work with product ops or DevOps. And so I think the operation roles can kind of like be confusing and not knowing who does what and where do the lines actually intersect. So charter, that's how we use it. The charter is basically like, what is your mission as an operations teams? What are the areas of focus? What are the things that you do? Who's the team? What is it, team makeup? And then, so I like to have that solidified. I like to have that aligned with my leadership team around the 30 days. And then more recently, I started to use the menu, and I think I borrowed that from you. And I think there was another person that actually introduced this idea of a menu. And basically, this is like double clicking into the charter when you get into the things that you do and don't do. And so the areas would be the organizational stuff and kind of like in product support. So the organization stuff is all the people practices, people tools, and then leadership support. So like some of us in heads of ops or, that kind of leadership role, you're usually supporting your executive design leadership. So you can kind of play this like pseudo chief of staff role. So there's a lot of things that need to be going to supporting your leadership team. And there's a lot of like people things that you need to do. There's a lot of tooling things. And then there's this whole slice of practices, which is going to fall into how do you support the teams themselves. And so I like to have this menu, and I like to use that as a calibration tool as well to really be clear about, hey, these are the things that we currently do. These are the things that we don't do. And then if the teams want to turn on certain areas and say, we want to do this, then we can have a conversation around resourcing, capacity. And then that tool plays really nicely in conjunction with the opportunities that we find from the design maturity assessment. And then what I like to do is use that not only just for operations, but you can use that as a way to calibrate with your design leadership team, invite them to be part of the maturity assessment, get them to write opportunity areas for each of the dimensions for their teams. And then together as one leadership team, you can come up with a collective plan for your roadmap. So not the typical planning we think of in terms of planning for the product, which is super important, but more a higher level up, which is saying like, who do we want to be as a design organization, as an operations team? How do we want to focus our efforts, align our efforts, and just kind of move towards this one goal, which is to have an amazing design team that's effective and also happy and impactful. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really funny. It's like, if there's one thing to take away for your first 30 days, it's just make space for the listening tour. If there's one thing post 30 days, let's say 30 to 60, it's have an artifact that you can centralize or that you can kind of circulate with your leadership to say, we need to agree on what are the behaviors and activities and expectations of our team, the design ops team, and what aren't the expectations. And that's the whole thing, right? The charter can be blown up to have all these different components. I like to centralize actually all of it into the single charter where you've got your essentially like strategic direction, vision, values, methods, obstacles, measures, where you are in the organization, who's on your team, your menu, which I would love to talk about in a second, roadmap, rituals, so on and so forth. And then it's just there. I think of this Eisenhower quote, which is plans are worthless, but planning is everything, right? The act of planning is actually the most important part here because things might fall apart. Another pandemic might crop up tomorrow and we need to adjust our entire business, but it's a force function for us to ask some very obvious questions where there's typically a ton of assumptions just like hiding within, right? And so bringing everything down into that simple menu, and I posted an example of one in the chat, but that menu is like, if you're going to do a single thing in terms of make an artifact, maybe don't blow it up and do a full-on charter. Highly recommend you do, but at least do the menu exercise, because the bottom line is, Ryan, I'm going to poke on something that you're saying here. This is not an atypical story in the chat. Ryan mentioned that he was a solo designer for years, finally getting some time to make a team, splitting his time between design work and actually like doing the buy-in for design operations. What that tells me, and by the way, not the only story like this, we hear this all the time in learning labs, we hear this in the DesignOps Slack group, is that, these things are typically happening. It's just the question is, who's doing that work? Sometimes it's the design leader. Sometimes it's like official communities of practice, sometimes called guilds. That's what we call them at DocuSign, where it's a lot of the people essentially doing like side of desk work on this design ops stuff. And sometimes it's a design ops person. the point is, like, design ops looks and feels a lot of different things to a lot of different people. A lot of conversations I find myself having with design leaders these days is like, well, what does design ops mean to you? And how is that different from my job? And that's like, it's a really it's a really simple question that can take like sometimes many of these sessions to get through. But I think ultimately it comes down to the point that you're making, which is like, what are we doing? What aren't we doing? And who's doing it? And then also for everything that was maybe not deemed as like urgent and important, and it was backlogged, when are we going to get to those things? So that's why I love the idea of a menu. It allows us to immediately tag current activities, current investments, where we need support. It allows us to tag from a responsibility and ownership model as to who is exactly doing what. And it also forces us to leave that conversation with the big question, which is, when are we going to revisit this? Because it's not static forever. And typically the answer is like, we'll revisit it in a quarter during our quarterly business review, or maybe you plan on halves, or we'll revisit it H2 or H1. Maybe you find yourself planning it more in like an annual cadence, and you just review it during the next annual planning cycle. But that's a critical question because then it just takes away ambiguity, and then you have full expectation with your leadership. Bonus points if you can actually put measures on each one of these things so that you can actually tell what good looks like as well. So that's my rant on all things charter. There's some questions around documents. To be completely candid, I don't think that I've seen like a Miroverse template out there for something like this, or a FigJam template or anything like that. So if somebody wants to make one, by all means, go ahead and do it. Otherwise, I don't know, maybe Kate's answering. Figma will help us out there and create some standards. Okay, so this all kind of gets us to like, I don't know, we're probably at like day 45, 60. Is there anything else that you're doing during this section before kind of going on to like the last third of your first 90 days? So far, we did the listening tour. We centralized everything into a menu, maybe even a charter. We agreed on what we're doing. It seems like now we're starting to move towards experiments. But did we miss anything?
No, I think that's right. I think one of the biggest things in reality, though, like the plan is happening, all of this is happening, but you're also in the weeds. Like you're probably in the weeds doing the work. You're diving into some low-hanging fruit areas and showing value really quickly. I think the thing that I can't underline more is the prioritization, because everyone's going to want to have everything done really fast. And so I think having that roadmap is going to be really clear. So by day 90, I already have like some initiatives that are solving those particular challenges or problems. If you have been able to bring in your leadership team to this exercise, then you have a collective roadmap versus just a design ops roadmap. And the reason that's really helpful is because it helps you scale yourself if you're smaller, because there are a lot of things within the 9 dimensions of maturity that design leaders can lead, similar to what you said, like if you have guilds or communities of practice, those people can lead. So I think like a perfect example is like I just partner on our hiring revamp process with an amazing designer on our team. She ended up doing the audit and she ended up partnering on the actual solution. So it just made my life so much easier, and also gave a really good opportunity for a talented person who is really passionate about this. And so those are all examples of how you can scale yourself as, if you're a small team, or just give opportunities to people who are really interested, and also really bring your leadership team to the fold. So the roadmap is really critical. So you have your menu, you can have all the items, and people can say like, great, I want all these things. And you have all your opportunities and your design maturity assessment, and everyone is like, these sound amazing, I want to do all these things. Hopefully you can benchmark them, or you have some kind of KPIs attached to them that exist, which is not common, but great to have. And then all of that needs to get put into a prioritization framework. And so by day 90, we have a clear plan of the prioritization framework. So what are we doing this quarter, next quarter, and the coming quarter? And what I like to do is monthly syncs, even though it's quarterly, because things in our world change constantly. And when I say ours, I mean like everyone here probably too. And so having that sync with your leadership team, having that plan and aligning on that plan and the prioritization is super key, because then you don't end up saying yes to everything. I am a yes person when it comes to like requests, because I just, I love my team. I want to make them happy. And it's going to help keep you honest about your capacity. And then it's going to help you to make a case for headcount. So look, all these things are important to you. Let's talk about how we can get some help in here and get some headcount. So
yeah. To your point, total yes person as well. Raised Catholic, middle child, a lot of pleases, thank yous, sorries. Like it was my biggest weakness for years coming into this profession. And it was also the thing that ended up kind of leading me to having all of these frameworks to like figure out what I can actually say yes to. And I still want to make people happy, right? And I think a lot of us in our positions just really enjoy just making the people that we work with have a better day and a better workflow and all that other stuff. So it can be super hard to say no, but it's super critical, right? Just this morning, I was listening to Masters of Scale by Reid Hoffman, co-founder of LinkedIn, and there was a great episode on burnout. And this is something that we've talked about for years. It's especially true for design ops people because we're so under-resourced, because it's such a nebulous field, because tracking the ROI of design ops is typically going to be pulled more towards like practice operations and workflow about the actual like craft of design within a company, which makes sense, right? The entire function was really born out of the design program manager. I think Courtney Kaplan was the first one at Facebook in 2014, but the entire practice is really stemmed from all things practice operations. And only recently have we started to expand design ops to be a little bit of org ops, a little bit of practice ops. And the org ops stuff is really important because that's where all the people management comes from, the core leadership support. And that stuff's incredibly hard to measure. I say this all because there's some stuff in the chat requesting KPIs. Yes, it's incredibly important to define success. Not all things that you end up doing are going to be measurable. And it's a really important idea to kind of take with you moving forward, and one that I've found that actually works really well with leadership, which is, I'm paraphrasing this. I got this from Aaron Walter. I don't know if this is his idea or someone else, but not everything that matters can be measured, and not everything that you measure matters. It's super important because as our entire function of design operations continues to get invested on, and the state of design ops report that we're working on is underlying this, more and more investments coming in, headcounts are going up. It's great. Salome, to your last point, when you take the menu and you go to leadership and you say, here's the other areas that we can have impact, and it's going to require X amount of resourcing. It's also important to know that basically anybody that goes on the org ops side of things might have a harder time really establishing dependable measures that aren't vanity metrics. These are things that, there's going to be a direct tie in quality to like employee experience and employee happiness. And there's things that we can grab onto like attrition and stuff like that. But as soon as we get to the attribution and influence layer of how much is my effort as a design operations leader on, let's say, like all things people operations, how much is that actually impacting the attrition scores or the retention scores of an organization? It's really fuzzy and it's hard to draw those lines. So just keep that in mind, that this is stuff that is really important, especially right now in like a hybrid workforce where everyone's trying to figure out this hybrid model. Even if organizations are unable to tie an ROI line to an energy line from design operations for, let's say, setting up hybrid working models, it does not mean that that investment should stop. It actually should mean that it should continue to be experimented on. That's all. That was my whole thing around measures and influence. And yes, KPIs are important. We should have things that we're trying to go for. But again, not everything in design operations is really clear to understand what my impact might be on the organization, in which case some anecdotes and qualitative feedback is going to be more helpful than maybe how much faster do we make workflow for one of the product teams out in the organization, which I think is kind of a good way to start framing up the last 90 days, right? So we talked about the listening tour. We talked about kind of centralizing everything into an artifact. We use the charter is kind of the mold. Within it, specifically, we've talked a lot about the design ops menu. And then you spoke about how once you have kind of this menu built out, how important it is to prioritize what you're doing now versus next versus later. And then from there, figuring out if you need any resources for anything that's an active activity by design operations. We talked about bonus points for measuring what those activities are. Now let's go ahead and frame it off to the end. It's you just jump in and let's say you have something resourced and you're good to go. How do you figure out, okay, we know that, let's say like there's a specific behavior within the design ops menu that we want to do. And we can pick any of those tiles as an example. I'm really curious how you would encourage people to think about framing experiments for a new behavior specifically. Do you have any frameworks or any ideas that you'd want people to kind of take forward as they're trying a brand new behavior that maybe they've never done before or the organization's never seen before?
Totally. This is just coming from the world of design, my background in design and lean UX. So the experiments within the book Lean UX are my favorites. So framing your hypothesis, defining your measures and your experiment success criteria is like what, you can do at the full scale, at like a super light scale is like, defining your hypothesis because you believe this initiative that you're about to take on is going to have X impact. And so, and then thinking about what the measures are. So some of them are going to be mostly qualitative, which is great. And then, I think I see one of the questions in the chat, measuring the value of design. How do you do that? Cost savings. Again, if you're picking one of those opportunities from the design maturity assessment, they have specific criteria for each of those dimensions of maturity, and they directly correlated with business impact. So if you haven't seen it, I would definitely check it out. It's not a perfect science. You can make it contextual to your organization, but there are specific measures that they've identified. For example, like if you are testing and learning often, so what does that mean in terms of ROI for the business? And so they are not perfect science, like I said, but at least they're directional and they're better than zero and really helpful. So I would start like that. And that's how I frame those experiments. And I say give it a timeline and an effort. And that goes into the prioritization. And we basically check in every month and we report what's happening with that initiative or that experiment, as you would say it.
Nice. Cool. Okay. So that kind of gets us to the first 90 days. I won't do another recap, but I will ask, was there anything that I missed, Salome? Are there any other like big ideas, any things that you would encourage people to keep in mind as they're going through the first 90?
I think the most important thing is to allow, grace for yourself and patience. Everything's going to be really, really hard. You're going to want to do everything all at once. And you're going to feel the stress. And I think the more you feel the stress, the less capable you'll be able to be. I think just remembering that everyone goes through the same thing and we're all challenged by feeling like we don't know what to do and we have so much to take on, and we're seeing everyone else's highlights and we see our own mess. So I think that's the biggest thing, to just be patient with yourself and be really honest about what you can and cannot do. And then I would say probably the most important thing is building relationships, and not just in a very cut and dry, like, let's figure out the challenges and let's talk about the work, but like really connecting with each person as an individual, especially your partners in product and engineering, because those are going to be the people that are going to create that right environment for your team. So if you are really in good graces and, friends with your product leaders and friends with your engineering leaders, when push comes to shove and you want to address or, introduce a new process or ask for help for working in a different way with your team, they're going to respond to you because they're going to like collaborating with you. And so I think that is something that is, really obvious, but at the same time, I think it's really underrated. Making sure that the softer skills and connecting with people and building friendships is really key.
Nice. Cool. And are there any other lessons that you've learned as to how to just be a better design ops practitioner in general? Maybe not everybody on the call is going to go into a design ops leadership role, but is there anything specific that you'd want to say as to just how to be a better design ops practitioner?
I thought another question, like if you're coming from a different position, I think anyone coming into design ops, I think it's helpful to have a background in design. I don't think it's necessary. I think having project management is really important. But I think one thing that I've found really helpful is I spent a lot of years as a consultant at a company called Pivotal Labs, and we worked really closely with engineering and products, and we basically like helped enable teams to work in a new way, like squads, like agile and lean, and like truly build something really fast and deliver code every day, and be really like the ideal dream that you think of, like how we want to work. We work that way with our clients. And so what I realized is so important to understand the product development flow and understanding what good looks like. And so I think there are some really good product resources that I'm a huge fan of, and I think every designer or design ops practitioner can also benefit from. So I love the work of Marty Kagan and all that work, Empowered, Inspired. I think it kind of like helps you understand what good could look like if you haven't been in that environment. And then that will help you have really impactful conversations with your product folks who usually are the drivers of strategy and have a lot of impact within an organization. So you want to be close with them. As well. Jeff Patton is another great person. He does a lot of workshops. I'm a huge fan of his workshops, and I took one, and he just really goes deep and gives you a lot of helpful frameworks in terms of the end-to-end product development flow. And then I think by the end of his workshop, you also get like your Scrum certificate. I think I got mine, but I don't know. I can't find it. I don't know where it is. But I love that. And I've referenced all of the resources that he shared, and it's become really, really helpful for me as I'm navigating through the different organizations that I've joined since, and being able to have really good conversations with partners, which I think is critical. Like, you know, we focus on operations, of design operations, but it's just like there's an ecosystem. So we have to make sure the ecosystem is healthy to support this healthy design team, not just we're getting our house in order and everything around us is on fire.
Sure. Yeah, it's really clear that you come from the world of, kind of the cutting edge of product design. There was another book that you put me onto a while back, The Build Trap by Melissa Perry. There was another great resource out there if anyone's looking for recommended reading.
Outcomes Over Outputs is another one by Josh Seiden. Fan of his work, and Lean UX is really good.
Yeah. Okay. So I think maybe it's a good time to just go into questions. I know we were already starting to do that, but Kate, did you want to take over?
Yes. All right. Let's see if we can make time for 2 or 3 questions. And feel free to drop some of your questions in the chat. And also, Adam already mentioned this, but if your question doesn't get answered, definitely join the DesignOps Assembly community in Slack. It's amazing. There's tons of people there that can answer your questions, and it's just a great place to be. So there's a couple really great questions here. One from Franco that I think is really relevant is, would the first 90 days look the same between a product company versus an agency?
I think so. I think the first 90 days could be applicable to everything. Well, maybe not the design maturity assessment, but I think the listening tour and approaching it like user research, having the consistent set of questions that you're asking everyone, synthesizing your themes and identifying your action plan, I think it could apply to any job. What do you think, Adam?
Yeah, I think let's say it like the 30,000, 20,000 foot level. I'm not sure if there's any difference. To your point, I'm not sure if hooking in our agency's behaviors into a design maturity assessment would necessarily help, but there's probably dimensions that absolutely are important, right? Like, I'd be mostly curious about the internal power dynamics in an agency, right? Like, what's my operations team truly supposed to be doing? Are there other ops teams? Salome mentioned the ecosystem map. That stuff is so important. It's like, what is my sphere of control versus what's my sphere of influence? And then how does that map out to the actual organization problems that I'm trying to solve for? And also, how can I better accelerate and catalyze top line OKRs for the company? they might not use OKRs, but there's most definitely going to be some sort of business goal, right? So that's the main point of the exercise, which is like, what am I doing here? How can I help solve known problems? How can I surface unknown problems? And then how can I support the top business goals? So that's really it, right? Like if a maturity index is going to help for your particular agency or consultancy, by all means, because that stuff's, you're going to end up being able to borrow credibility from a big project that already established credibility. And so that's kind of why we use the maturity index, is just to like help us not have to swim in such ambiguous waters. And also kind of going to those known design dimensions, which is why I like the new design frontier that Salome mentioned as well.
I put it in a chat too. Sorry for spamming the chat, but hopefully there's a way to consolidate all those links for you all. I don't know if there's a share out after.
Oh yeah, we'll be sharing everything out in an email, and we have Vanessa from Figma on the call who will make sure all of that's captured for everyone here. Let's take another question from the Q&A chat here. Ketrin asked a really good question. They said, curious to hear your thoughts on where DesignOps should be positioned within the org or team. And then they also said, sphere of influence seems critical. Based on my experience, having access to the right people and right platform can easily set you up for success or failure, especially if you're not head of DesignOps.
Do you want? I can go.
Sure. Sorry, where, Kate, was this in the Q&A?
Yeah, and just to reiterate, the core question there is, where should DesignOps be positioned within the organization or team?
Cool.
I find it really helpful we've seen different models, but having it be positioned within design, I find it really helpful, because then you don't have two different goals that are kind of like dividing for your attention, because you're going to do what's right for the design organization versus what is right for another organization, which is often has different measures that they're trying to achieve. And so I've seen frictions in not necessarily DesignOps, but I've seen in other organizations in the past where, for example, product ops does not roll up to product, and it's just an operations role. And so that can cause some confusion and friction. So I think organizationally, I think that's the most healthier and frictionless way for the team to be organized.
Yeah. I'm going to answer this. I'll give you my 2 cents. Maybe it's not an answer, but I'll give you my perspective. And I'm also going to try and answer another question that came up from Filippo at the same time. So I think the whole thing is, it depends, right? The smaller the organization, if I'm a startup of 5, I don't need several ops teams. I'm not even sure if I need like an ops person at that point, but there's going to eventually be someone who has to deal with the efficiency and efficacy of our organization. How can we improve profits and reduce costs? That's an operations specialist, right? As the organization grows, and I should say as the company grows by headcount, there's going to be complexities, and then there's probably going to be a need not only for a top line operator, but there's also going to have to be a need for more specific discipline operators. And that need ends up compounding by the law of large numbers, right? So answering this question for a team of 50 versus a team of 50,000 is so different. But the general rule is that as things get bigger, it takes more effort and energy to actually create organization and efficiencies and efficacies. Because not only do you have more people, more thoughts, more work, you also have systems that end up compounding their own systematic debt against each other. And so, like an organization like Google or Salesforce, it's the amount of ops teams that are here are not in small numbers. And I would also say that there's probably not enough of them. And I'm not speaking on behalf of Google, just large teams everywhere, because designing products is incredibly hard and scaling is so difficult. So Filippo, to your question, should we focus on company ops, versus design ops in a scenario where maybe there's like issues with the company operations? I mean, if you can control those things, sure. But oftentimes we'll find that, a design operator only has influence at the office of the COO or office of the PMO. Whoever is controlling major company operations generally is too far away from my design team for me to have an impact up there. But what I can do as a design operator is show models for success of what works here, and then they can borrow from those thinking, or vice versa, right? Like, it's not like we're the best operators in the company. Maybe you are, and if you are, awesome. But what I've usually found is that there's typically some really good thinking that's happening all over an organization. We can all borrow from each other's thinking. So should you start with one of the over the other? I don't know. That's probably a bigger question that warrants more time. But if you do have a design ops team or headcount to invest in design operations, I would always be thinking, how might our system that we build to deal with this problem also be lent out to deal with other system issues that are happening within the company? And if you can do that, you're going to help everyone, right? So win-win.
Amazing. Let's see if we can grab another question here. This was an earlier question in the chat, and this guest said, how do you measure the impact of design in the organization in terms of cost saving? How would you prove that a certain design effort led to reduced cost and customer support in the long run?
I think I typed my answer in the chat in terms of the new design frontier. So I linked that there. I encourage you to check it out. Again, it's not a perfect science, but they do have metrics, and they do show how the involvement of design, in particular 9 dimensions, have led to the ROI. So I think that is a really helpful tool. And then who is the, I never know how to say her name. I apologize. I'm a huge fan of her work. Patricia. I'm going to find the links. And so she has an amazing framework for measuring the value of design ops. So that's just outside of just design. So we can, perfect. Yeah. So I think that's another really helpful tool for design ops practitioners, but the design maturity index is the one that I love to use for the impact of design.
Yeah, this is also, everyone's trying to figure this out. And if you feel like you are close, you should be writing a book or going on a podcast tour. There are a lot of, there's a lot of great thinking that's been done out there by Forrester, by McKinsey, by some folks that we mentioned on the New Design Frontier, Leah and Aaron and all those folks. There are certain things that are a lot easier to tie in value to other things. I would just keep in mind those 2 areas where you can typically find value, which is areas of efficiency and areas of efficacy. Efficiency is at a low-hanging fruit, which is why so many design operators look at like their tool stack as a way of where they say, okay, great, I just joined. Where is the opportunity to reduce waste? Taking Salome's idea around lean, and so many people go to the tool stack because it's typically an area where there's a ton of waste, right? As far as connecting designs efforts more broadly to valuation, it's probably a longer conversation, and I would just redirect you to any of the talks that are recorded out there on the New Design Frontier. I would specifically Google Leah Bewley. She was probably, it's a few years old, but she was probably the closest person that I can think of in the world, maybe, to the data set of 2,200 different companies, to Salome's earlier point. And she was able to really tie out which behaviors were directly connected to actually moving business impact. And she did a fairly good job of removing the squishiness of attribution. So she would look at P-scoring of certain behaviors as far as like increase in value for the actual business. And it was rarely was it a one-to-one connection between like a design activity to an extra dollar earned for an organization. But she was able to like identify some of the common activities to go after. So I just redirected that report.
Amazing. Thanks, y'all. Let's take one more question before we close out. I really like this question from Prabhu that says, how different would it be to carry out design ops virtually as opposed to in person? And I love this question, as we're all sort of adjusting to this remote first reality, maybe we could leave everyone with just some advice for practicing design ops in our sort of new remote first world.
Yeah, Salome, do you mind if I start?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, my take is that this should be the main thought that we all circulate around. How can we make a remote first operations work, regardless of if you're hybrid, if you're, it's going to be a better system simply because we don't know what's going to happen with the current pandemic. I mean, this has just been like a really eye-opening moment for companies, right? Is holy cow, like the office used to be a place where people come to work. And now it seems like it's transitioning to, this is more of a place where we keep our culture connected, if we have it at all. And so where the actual work happens seems to be happening less in the office and more on the computer. So having to take that as a guide is really, really helpful. We're talking about this a lot in our learning labs that I mentioned earlier, which I'm going to just give a quick plug to. I'll drop it in the chat, but this is kind of how we're framing a lot of our discussions in learning labs, which is, why wouldn't you ever take a remote first situation when you're building a new system or going to a systematic improve?
Yeah, totally. I think +1 to that, but also having a really good Slack strategy, organization, Google Docs organization strategy is just going to be really key just in general. But then, like having those templates and workshops and frameworks and facilitator trainings, that's going to be really helpful for your team. You have to have a strategy for that. So I think that's going to be really helpful. As you can be really helpful as a design ops leader in that area too.
Amazing. All right, everyone. I think we're going to close this out. Before I read off from here, Adam, did you want to make any announcements before we part ways?
Yeah, there's so much stuff coming out very soon. So there's a new State of Design Ops report that's like the de facto benchmark study on all things ops. There was questions around ratios, reporting lines. It's all coming. Please keep an eye out for that. And the best place to stay in tune is going to be in the Design Ops Slack, where we'll do announcements in there and probably on our social. That's coming in about 2 months. We're also launching learning labs. So if you find yourself as somebody who learns really good with others around you in small groups, that's exactly what learning labs is built for. There's 3 levels to it. There's basically like the fundamentals of design ops, emerging leaders, and established leaders. We have amazing teachers. Salome is a teacher. I learned a ton from her. Dominique Ward is a teacher. Taylor from last week, others. So please, if you want to hang out with us, either come hang out with us in the Slack. That's free for everybody. Or if you want to like really invest into your design ops education pathway, join us in Learning Labs. We've got some cool stuff going on.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Adam. And thank you so much, Salome, y'all. This was just so great. And also thank you everyone for joining us today. I really hope you got as much out of this as we did and as I did. So just, some end housekeeping. If you missed some of this and some of the links we shared, have no fear. We'll include them all in, as well as the recording, in a follow-up email this week. Also, to check out more Figma live streams, including part 3 of the series, head to figma.com/events. All of our streams are recorded. So even if you can't make it live, you should definitely register so you can receive the recording. And if you have any ideas or suggestions on topics, we are always here, community@figma.com. That is all we have for today. Thank you so much again to our amazing panelists. Really excited to hopefully see y'all for the 3rd installment of the series.
Cool.
Thanks you both.
Thanks, Kate,
so
and
much,
thanks
Kate.
everyone. It was so nice to see such a, everyone around the world coming. So we really appreciate everyone tuning in different time zones.
All right.
All right. See y'all.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.